Hello student, today we will discuss about the railway gauges. Railway gauges mean, as we discussed in the last classes, what is the gauge? So gauge is basically the distance between the inner of the railways, the inner of the rails. So the distance between the inner rails is known as the gauge. Now how many types of gauges are there? What are the classifications, advantage and disadvantage of the various gauges will be discussed in today's class. So before going to the class, let me introduce myself. Myself, Dr. Debasish. I am Assistant Professor of Civil Engineering Department, GIS College of Engineering, Kalyani. Here is my contact details are given. So if you have any query, you can reach me in the given contact details. So what is the rail gauge? So rail gauge is the distance between the inner side of two parallel rails that make up a single rail line. Rail gauge is the distance between two rails of a railroad. 60% of the world's railway uses 4 feet, that is 4 feet 8.5 inches gauge, that is 1435 mm or 1.435 meter, which is known as the standard gauge or the international gauge. Rail gauges larger than the standard gauge are called as a broad gauge, and the rail gauges smaller than the standard gauge are called as a narrow gauge. So the standard is the 1.435 meter, and if the gauges are more than standard gauges, it is a broad gauge. If it is a less than the standard, it is the narrow gauge. So you can find out in narrow gauge or the meter gauge in hilly area, and broad gauge in the normal plain terrain. A dual gauge railway has three or four rail positions so that the trains of two different gauges can use it. A place where different gauges meet is called as the break gauge. So this is the rail gauge. This is one rail. This is one wheel. This is another wheel. This is the wheel axle. This is rail one and this is rail two. So wheels are moving on this rail. So the distance between this rail is known as the rail gauge. Now, what is median diameter? The median diameter is the diameter between the two the two portion, the distance between the two portions coning of wheel. This is the median diameter. Now, what are the various type of the rail gauges? So, rail gauges are basically broad gauge, meter gauge, and narrow gauge. So, the length of the broad gauge is 1.676 meter. The meter gauge is from the definition or the name itself. You can find out what is the meaning. It's meter gauge means it is 1 meter, and narrow gauge means say 0.762 meter or 0.610 meter. These are some classification of the rail gauges in Indian scenario. Now the next topic is type of the rail gauges in some pictorial view. So if you see that the narrow gauges, this is 0.610. This is again another type of narrow gauges. It is 0.67762 meter. This is meter gauges. It is 1 meter. It is standard gauges 1.435 meter, and it is broad gauges 1.676 meter. So this broad gauge, this one is the broad gauge, and these three are the narrow gauges. So the standard is basically 1.435. Next, what is broad gauge? So when the clear horizontal distance between the inner faces of two parallel rails forming a track is 1676 millimeter, the gauge is called as the broad gauge. This gauge is also known as the standard gauge of the India and is the broadest gauge of the world. The other countries using the broad gauge are Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Argentina, etc. 50% of in railway tracks, Indian railway tracks have been laid on this gauge. So maximum more than 50%, actually more than 50% tracks are on this broad gauge. Apart from India, the few other countries are also using the broad gauge, that is the 1.676 meter. It is Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Brazil, Argentina, like this. So what is the suitability of the broad gauge? So broad gauge is suitable under the following condition: when the sufficient funds are available for the railway project, because when we are providing some extra spaces between two rails, means we need larger dimension of the sleeper, we need more amount of ballast, we need more land to construct this railway track. So everything will increase the project cost. So if we have the sufficient amount of fund for the project cost, then we can provide the broad gauge. When the prospects of revenue are very bright, yes, in Indian scenario, thousand or lakhs of crores rupees are earned through revenue from the railway. So if the users are maximum users are using the railway, so there is no harm to provide this broad gauge. This gauge is therefore used for the track in plain areas where are where are densely populated, that is for routes of maximum traffic intensities and at places which are a center of industry and the commerce. So meter gauge, when the clear horizontal distance between the inner faces of two parallel rails forming a track of 1000 millimeter, the gauge is known as the meter gauge. The other countries using the meter gauge are France, Switzerland, Argentina, etc. 40% of Indian railway tracks have been laid on this gauge. What is the suitability? The meter gauge are when the funds are available for the railway projects are inadequate, when the prospects of revenue are not very bright. So this gauge is therefore used for the track in underdeveloped area or and in interior area. Now what is narrow gauge? When the clear horizontal distance between the inner faces of two parallel rails are forming a either 762 meter or 762 millimeter or 610 millimeter, the gauge is known as the meter gauge, sorry, the narrow gauge. The other countries than the India is Britain, South Africa are using this narrow gauge. So only 10% of Indian railway having laid on this gauge. So 50% on broad gauge, 40% on narrow gauge, meter gauge, and 10% on narrow gauge. So what is the suitability? When the construction of the track with a wide gauge is prohibited due to the provision of the sharp curve, steep gradient, narrow bridges or the tunnels, or when the prospects of the revenue are not very bright. This gauge is therefore used in hilly and very thinly populated area. The feeder gauge is commonly used for feeding raw materials to big government manufacturing concern as well as to private factories such as the steel plant, oil refinery, sugar factories, etc. Uniformity in gauges, but we should keep the uniformity in the gauges. How? So one country should have only one gauge throughout its various parts. But the policy of India and the topographical, geological, financial condition have led to adopt various gauge in different parts. So as per the rules, country or individual country should adhere the single gauge system, but due to the variety of the topographical, due to the financial variation in Indian scenario, if the three types of gauges are observed based on the region, based on the population, based on the topographical aspects. So what is the advantages of breaking the gauges? So the most effective advantages of breaking the gauges is to render the railway an economical and profitable concern. It facilitates the provision of a steeper gradient, sharp curve, narrow tunnels by adopting a less wide gauges in hilly and the rocky area. What are the disadvantages? So it causes much inconvenience to the passengers while changing the train at station with change of gauge. It causes delay in movement of the people and goods, because when we are moving in a narrow gauge or the meter gauge, the speed will be definitely drastically reduced than the broad gauge. It results in wastage of time. It involves extra labor for unloading and reloading the goods. The goods are also likely to be damaged or dislocated at the junction station having change of the gauge. It requires the provision for extra and costly transshipment yard, go downs, shades, etc. at every junction station having change of gauge. It causes the extreme difficulty in quick movement of the military and the ammunition during war days. So, what is the loading gauge? A loading gauge defines the maximum height and width for railway vehicles and their loads to ensure the safe passenger through bridges, tunnels, and structures. The loading gauges determine the size of the passenger trains and the size of the shipping container that can be conveyed on a section of the railway line and varies across the world, often within the single railway system. Loading gauges. A loading gauges is the envelope or the contour shape within which all the railroad cars, locomotive coaches, buses, trucks, and other vehicles must fit. It varies between the different countries and may also vary on the different lines. within a country. For example, metro trains might have a smaller lodging gauge than conventional trains to allow the smaller tunnel. So in that cases, the metro trains may run on conventional tracks, but not vice versa. So this is the loading gauges. You can see the loading gauges. There is some steel arc over the rails are there. So the width and the vertical post, the gauges, top level of the rails, all the component of the loading gauges are displayed in this diagram. So this is the loading gauge, you can see. So basically these things are installed at the some container where we put some container in the train. We need to install this type of loading gauges. So this is the typical loading gauges. You can find the horizontal beam, the chain, the angle iron profile, the vertical post, and the rail level. So these are the five component of the loading gauges. So in more recent time, the term loading gauges has fallen out of use among the railway professionals since it is purely static concept and ignore other factors affecting clearance. Indian Railway gauge track have every large loading gauges. Uh, it is of 3.6 meter wide and 5.3 meter high for a passenger train. If in India, 3.25-meter wide and 7-meter high on freight only lines, and 3.25-meter wide and 6.1 meter high on the passenger lines. So these are the some guideline on the loading gauges. Next, we will the construction gauges. By adding the suitable clearance at the top side of the loading gauges, construction gauge is obtained. It decides the dimensions such as the height and width of the structure in bridges and tunnels along the track so that all wagons may pass through them without any damages. So this is all about this is all about your gauges. What are the various type of gauges? That is the broad gauge, narrow gauge, meter gauge. So broad gauge is basically 1.676 meter. Meter gauge is 1 meter. The narrow gauge is 0.676 meter or 0.61 meter, and the standard is 1.43 meter. So this is all about the your various types of gauges, where we use which type of gauges, what is the percentage of the gauges used in the India. So this is all about some theoretical concept of the your gauges. So this is for today's class. If you have any doubt, my contact details are given. So thank you till the next class.